And you've just heard Good Night, the new single from Solareye, which is out now. And I'm delighted to be joined by the man who is Solareye, Dave Hook. Hello, Dave.
Hi there, how you doing? Good to
I'm
see you
really
back.
well. I'm really well. Good to see you. So tell us about Good Night, because it's the first Solareye release for a while, isn't it?
It's the first for a good few years actually, 2 or 3 years minimum. I feel like it's the first proper beginning of first proper release for longer than that, probably since the Solar Eye album. All these people are me. And it's the first in a series, basically of records that I've written over the last 5 years that I've kind of collected together now and think it's about time I got them out. If for no other reason than to sort of clear the buffer and be ready to start again, Ali. So yeah, and so Good Night's the first single. It's it's partially a sort of story told stood in the middle of a civilization on the brink of collapse, which may or may not be a relatively near future sort of storytelling exercise.
It's got, well, certainly, we'll talk a bit about the lyrics in it as well, because they're quite interesting, but it's got that kind of dystopian feel to it. Is that fair to say?
I absolutely, although maybe only mirroring the dystopia of reality, always, and yeah, I kind of I got interested in a few different things of ways of telling stories over the last few years. This song and this collection of songs actually, the catalyst for them came from um, a week residency that I did at a place called Cove Park, which was
Mhm.
actually now 5 years ago next month. So it was just before lockdown,
Right.
and that was where it all began for the writing of these songs. It was an incredible opportunity I got through the sound and visual art folks at Cryptic. And so it's a totally remote sort of wilderness on the Argyll Peninsula, and being there in uh, the early February in storms and thunder and snow and all sorts, and my writing space was a third of a shipping container on this sort of this hill overlooking a loch. So it was a pretty incredible place to go and do some writing. And what I found was over the course of writing there in that week, my writing sort of adapted to my space, I guess, a little bit,
Right.
and that maybe a lot of my writing might have a more sort of urban imagery from sort of reflecting your surroundings. And I think that was all still there, but it started to also encompass the spaces that I was in for in terms of storytelling. Um, and it brought out it created the beginning of a few songs sort of relating to that, and to sort of rewilding of sort of urban spaces and urban decay becoming sort of new wilderness and all these sorts of things. So these sorts of ideas came out of it.
And I mean, you say a lot of the songs have their roots back then, 5 years ago. As time has gone on, do they seem even more relevant than they did when you started to write them?
I think uh, they don't feel out of place in the direction the world's heading. There's ideas about migration and borders and boundaries and where people live, and these invisible lines that separate folks. There's ideas about climate and sort of um, potential environmental disasters. There's stuff about culture and society. There's also wee stories and love songs and relevant sort of just I'm not finding that necessarily the collection of songs is limited by
Theme.
a by too stringent a theme. Like even if this was a collection of songs broadcast from the brink of societal collapse at some point in the next 50 to 100 years, it would still have individual wee stories of whatever was happening in a person's life at that point.
Yeah. Oh, that's often where the real kind of human stories is found, isn't it? Underneath the big overall themes that are happening, it's the kind of interactions between individuals. So this is the first release from an album, is that right?
It's the first release from an album, and yeah, so and that's kind of the main themes behind it. That and just Scottish hip hop culture seeps into it a lot as well, you know, because I'm not the first person to make this connection, I don't think, within the Scottish hip hop community, but I was interested in the idea of the sort of old idea of the sort of keeper of the clans, the Shanachie, that was the Gaelic, Scots Gaelic term for the keeper of the clans, was an oral historian, and that idea that that person now is potentially a rapper, you know, it's a mirror of what a rapper does in contemporary culture and society, or what any folk musician does in culture and society, you know. So sort of just pulling all those wee threads together to tell some stories, ultimately.
And in terms of Scottish hip hop scene or community, how you want to call it, you've been doing this for a while, if you don't mind me saying.
I have indeed.
So, I mean, have you seen what kind of changes have you seen, if any, across?
I mean, over the years, it's been good to see hip hop in Scotland becoming more visible, and more broadly considered a viable, legitimate form of art and expression, which it hasn't always been considered, you know. So that's great. I think it still seems to face this ongoing battle of like being considered a real thing, which is bizarre considering, you know, it's been a creative form in Scotland since the late 80s, early 90s, you know. But it is nice as you get a bit older to see new generations doing interesting stuff and exciting things, you know, and sort of moving things forward in different ways, as culture people do in culture and society. So that's been a cool thing to see, and it's good as well to see. One of the things I think about, one of the things lots of folk maybe talk about of a certain age in hip hop, is that it was a youth culture. It came from young people. It was created by young African Americans and Puerto Ricans. You know, and then it became such a huge phenomenon. Obviously, it became a global phenomenon. It was still a youth culture for years and years. And then how do you continue to be a part of that culture as you get older, when a big core part of it was always about new voices and youth and challenging previous generations and all these sorts of things. So it's interesting to see how, as rap artists get older, how do they still find ways to sort of express themselves in a way that works, you know?
I think that's really interesting, because hip hop, in terms of musical movements, is one of the most recent ones, but it's the same thing faced with rock and roll faced or jazz faced. You know, back then initially it was a young person's music, wasn't it? And then, you know, you have the Rolling Stones and folk touring and Dylan and all that still touring later on. I guess hip hop has had to face up to that later than other movements may have.
That's it. And I think it's just about, I think the artists that do it best for me are the ones that are able to update who they are as artists, rather than try to replicate who they were as artists. You know, so you know, at any level, at the highest level possible, Jay-Z is a perfect example of someone who manages to remain authentic whilst changing. You know, and from a underground sort of rap perspective, A$AP Rock is another example of that, who manages to be who they are now and reflect that in their art, rather than trying to be who they were. You know, and then you see great artists in Scotland doing that now. Loki's doing that incredibly well.
Yep.
Bose does that. You know, like there's artists around the country who think about that stuff and then manage to find new ways of expressing yourself as you change as a person.
And has making music changed for you over the years as well? I'm thinking about technological changes, the way that you can perhaps produce a whole album from home now, that maybe it couldn't have been the case when you started.
I mean, it has for me, especially at the moment over the last few years as well, probably because I've not been working with the band as much as I had. I mean, there's lots of chat between the folks in Stanley Odd that we'll hopefully do some work together this year. But I've been doing a lot more of just creating and producing the stuff myself over the last wee while. And these songs are certainly that. The Good Night actually started as a loop that Harvey Keitel sent me. There's that sort of reversed string loop that sort of was the nexus of it, and then I built everything else around it, and I actually built it once I'd written the lyrics to then shape the song around the words. So in some ways, if you're working on your own like that, there's a lot of work involved, but in other ways, it's nice because you know what your intention is musically and lyrically, so you can start to try and make the connections between that. And like you say, the technology's there to do that. I do most of my work in my instrumental creative space is Ableton Live, and then I sort of transfer that to Pro Tools when I'm mixing and mastering it. So I use two different DAWs, and then whatever other bits of hardware I can get my hands on.
I was going to ask you about Stanley Odd because I was saying before we started recording, I think the last time we spoke was when Stay Odd came out. And remind me, was that before COVID?
That was just after. So we started the beginnings of that, releasing that album as we were going into lockdown. Right. And then I think we put the record out we called the release, our sort of release gig was an online gig because we weren't quite out of lockdown yet, because we called it the last night in. So it must have been just as we were about to be allowed out again. Right. So 2021 was when the Stanley Odd record came out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That was, to me, that was it was a big record. There was kind of lots of collaboration on it, obviously, as well. So it's good to hear that you may be doing something else from that.
I mean, the toughest thing with Stanley Odd really is that everybody's working musicians. So, and if they're not working on Stanley Odd, then they're working somewhere else. So, people's diaries fill up with work over the course, the year prior to the year you're in. Yeah. And so the WhatsApp group is continually, here's a list of dates, and people say, no, I can't do this and I can't do that. And when will we get together? What we would like to do this year is a couple of residential, sort of, say 3 or 4 day residentials at a studio somewhere, and just stay together for a few days at a time and make some music. And I think that would be enough, to be honest, to get a record together.
Yeah.
Because the way we've worked in previous years has been you bring your demos with you to these sessions, so you're not starting from scratch, and then you listen through and you pick things and then start working on them. And it's a great fun way to get, when you don't necessarily get as much time to hang about as you did 20 years ago, then, to get together and make some music. So that's what I would like to do with Stanley Odd this year.
Well, that sounds great. Everyone brings their own thing to the party, and you do it that way.
Aye, and if you stay, if you've got, there's a few good places where you can stay at, you can live in the studio for 4 days or something, or like a bunkhouse next to it or something like that, and it means you can kind of work all day long and all night long, and just rattle through stuff.
Well, I'm talking about collaborations. I saw you as part of A Giant on a Bridge, which was at the Edinburgh Fringe this year with big success. I think even award-winning, is that right? I mean, it really got a lot of good positive notes.
It did really well, and it was great. It was great to be involved in, and it was great to see it being well received. It's been many years in the making, that. So Joe Mango.
Let people know what it is, because some people might not know what it is. It's a piece of, you could say it's musical theatre, but that's too simple to call it that.
I mean, the term, which I wasn't particularly familiar with beforehand, was gig theatre. I think that was one of the terms that folks were using to describe it. It's basically a collection of songs that, when you put them together, they tell a cohesive story, and the songs are also sort of augmented by each musician taking on the character of the people in the songs sometimes. So it lives somewhere between a gig and a piece of theatre.
Yeah.
And so you've got 5 musicians on stage. Each person embodies one of the characters in the story. And then they'll have songs that are particularly focused on them, but all the songs are played as a band. And then there's a sort of cohesive narrative throughout. It tells the story of a guy who is just about to be released from prison called Dee, and his sister has been looking after his wee girl whilst he's been in. So that's one of the stories or the narratives that's there. Louis Abbott's character is a songwriter who goes into work in prisons, which is where this all sort of came from. And Joe Mango's character is a letter writer who helps folk write letters in prisons. And then there's also a sort of fairy tale interwoven into it as well by Kim Grant. So there's a range of sort of stories that over the course of the thing sort of weave in and out of each other.
And musically, as you've mentioned, they are very different artists as well. So, you know, it really is something for everyone in terms of the styles of music that you're going to hear.
Aye, and it came about because, well, first of all, Louis headed up a project, an organisation called Vox Liminis, called Distant Voices, which involved getting musicians to go into prisons on 3-day songwriting sessions. Most of us that are performing on it took part in a bunch of those sessions or facilitated them or whatever you want to call them, and helped went in and did songwriting with folks. And some of the songs that came out of that were really incredible songs. It was, you know, it was quite a powerful experience going in and doing songwriting sessions and the songs that came out of them. And then Joe was the driving force behind turning this into a piece of theatre that she's worked on with Liam Hurley as the dramaturg behind it all. And the two of them are the sort of producers of making it become what it is now. It's been really exciting to do. It's also really nice to step into a totally different world, and it's interesting for me how very different theatre world is. You know, like you need to learn a whole bunch of things that you don't really think about as a musician in terms of like where you stand and how you address the audience, and it's so quiet on stage compared to a gig that's terrifying to begin with.
And it's coming to Celtic Connections. We should mention it's coming to Celtic Connections at the Tramway on the 22nd of January, I think.
That's right. Yeah, it's been great. So it's good to see. I think it's going to be doing more things in the future. And the next thing up is Celtic Connect. I love Celtic Connections at the best of times. It's always great to be involved in it. And I've also found, from a hip hop perspective, you end up doing some really interesting collaborations at Celtic Connections and things that you might not have had the opportunity to do before, you know. And so it's great. It's great that Giant and the Bridge is going to be there, and Tramway's a brilliant venue to go and do it at.
Yeah, and if people didn't manage to catch it in Edinburgh, I really do recommend it. It's a brilliant show, a really moving show as well. So
great musicians, brilliant to play with those guys, you know, and it's a super cool band to be a part of.
It's actually a real kind of Scottish supergroup on stage when you see it, isn't it?
It's a good bunch of folks. I saw there was one quote which I mentioned to the guys from one review that said Scottish supergroup and rapper. I was like, great.
Here's for that, absolutely. Well, we haven't mentioned. Have you got a date for when the album's coming out? Do you know when that's going to be?
I will figure that out. Do you know what? I'm putting this single out was just forcing me to get moving, to be honest, Ali. And I'm going to, because I haven't actually put anything out in so long, I'm going to put out a single every 3 to 4 weeks until such a time as I feel I've put enough out. And what that's going to do is force me to finish the mix of the previous one quickly enough that I can then get it where it needs to go for distribution for the next one. So I'm hoping to put out 7 or 8 singles, one every 3 to 4 weeks, starting on Friday.
So there's going to be plenty of Solareye coming early in 2020.
There's going to be plenty. There's going to be plenty of Solareye, and like I was saying, I think the songs are decent. I think they hang together as a record anyway. But it'll also be nice to clear the buffer of these tunes that have sort of collected themselves over the last few years and then start afresh on something else after it. but I think I will do it as a physical release. Hopefully, do a wee short run vinyl release, one of the singles plus a couple of extra things at the end of it.
Well, I'm really enjoying listening to Good Night, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of them as well. Dave, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's always a pleasure.
Pleasure as always. Yeah, thanks for having me, man. A pleasure as always. You know, and you know, you put a huge amount of work into sharing such a vast range of Scottish cultural things. So, aye, keep it up.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I don't know what I would do if I didn't do it, to be honest. And this is Solareye featuring Daisy Miles and Ghost 2.